Welcome back to Terrifying Stories. Before we dive in, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you want to support this channel and go even deeper, the Patreon link is in the description and the pinned comment below. Now, let's get into it. I took the job because I needed money fast and the timing worked out. A friend of my cousin knew a family that owned a peach orchard outside a small town in southern Georgia. They had to leave for a funeral in Tennessee and needed somebody to stay on the property for a week. The pay was cash. All I had to do was feed 2 dogs twice a day, keep an eye on equipment, and sleep in the farmhouse at night. It sounded simple enough. The orchard sat at the end of a narrow dirt road about 15 minutes from the highway. The property stretched farther than I expected. Rows of peach trees covered the land in every direction, straight lines disappearing into darkness once the sun went down. During the day, the place looked peaceful. The trees were thick with leaves and fruit. Fallen peaches rotted in the dirt between rows and filled the air with a sweet smell mixed with heat and insects. The farmhouse was old but clean. Single-story place with faded white paint and a metal roof that popped when the temperature changed. There were muddy work boots lined beside the back door and family photos all over the kitchen walls. The owners left instructions written on yellow paper taped to the fridge. Feed the dogs at 6 in the morning and 6 at night. Keep the floodlights on after dark. Lock the barn. Watch for people stealing fruit. The dogs were blue heelers named Cash and Dolly. Smart animals. Quiet most of the time. They followed me everywhere during the day and slept near the porch at night. The second thing I noticed inside the house was the corkboard near the kitchen table. It was covered in old missing animal flyers. Dogs mostly. Hunting dogs, farm dogs, mutts. Some flyers were sun-faded and curling at the edges. One was for a goat with a brown patch over one eye. A few had phone numbers scratched out with marker. At first I assumed coyotes had gotten them. The first 2 nights were calm. I sat on the porch after feeding the dogs and listened to the orchard. The trees made noise even without wind. Branches creaked. Peaches dropped into the dirt with soft thumps. Sometimes I heard movement deeper in the rows. Slow rustling sounds. I figured deer were wandering through looking for fallen fruit. The third night felt different from the start. The air stayed heavy after sunset. No breeze at all. You could smell fertilizer and rotten peaches hanging over the orchard. The dogs ate early but stayed close to the porch afterward. Usually they wandered around the yard before settling down. That night they planted themselves near the steps and stared into the trees. Not barking, watching. Every few minutes one of them gave a low growl without taking its eyes off the orchard. Around 11 I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and walked off the porch. I remember how the dogs refused to follow me. Cash stood up halfway like he wanted to come but stopped at the edge of the dirt yard. Dolly stayed flat against the porch boards staring forward. That bothered me more than anything. The flashlight barely cut through the rows once I got between the trees. The branches blocked most of the moonlight. The ground was uneven from tractor ruts and fallen fruit. Gnats swarmed around my face every time I slowed down. You could hear peaches hitting the ground all around you. Soft thump. Another farther away. Then silence again. I walked maybe 50 yards from the house when I heard whistling somewhere ahead. One short whistle. A few seconds later, another one farther to the left. Human. No question about it. I yelled out toward the trees and said I'd already called the sheriff. My voice sounded weak out there. The rows swallowed sound fast. The whistling stopped immediately. I stood there listening. Nothing. Then somewhere behind me a peach dropped from a branch and made me jump. I turned around and started heading back toward the house. Halfway there my flashlight passed over something hanging from a tree farther down the row to my right. At first I thought somebody had hung up an old jacket or scarecrow. Then the beam settled on fur. It was a dog. Medium-sized black dog hanging from a low branch with wire twisted tight around its neck. Its back legs barely touched the ground. Fresh blood stained the fur near its mouth. Flies covered its face and stomach. The smell reached me a second later. Rot mixed with something metallic. I froze right there staring at it. The wire around the neck had been wrapped carefully, almost neat. Whoever did it took time. Then I heard a branch crack behind me. Heavy footsteps started moving through the orchard. Slow, not trying to hide anymore. I backed away from the hanging dog and turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the rows blocked everything. I couldn't see more than a few trees ahead. The footsteps kept coming at the same pace. Crunch, crunch, every step steady. I started walking faster toward the farmhouse. The footsteps matched me somewhere behind the trees. When I stopped, they stopped too. I could hear breathing once. Not close enough to see anyone. Close enough to know they were there. I made it back to the yard and nearly slipped climbing the porch steps. The dogs were already standing now, growling hard toward the orchard. Their backs were stiff and shaking. I locked the doors, checked every window, and turned off the inside lights so I could see outside better. The orchard looked black beyond the floodlights. The trees moved slightly now, even though there still wasn't much wind. I kept expecting somebody to walk out. Around midnight, I saw movement near the edge of the nearest row. A shape crossing between trees. Too low for a deer, too controlled. Then gone again. The dogs lost it after that. Barking deep and violent toward the orchard. Not random barking either. Focused on one spot. At around 2 in the morning, something slammed against the side of the house 3 times. Bang, bang, bang. Not loud enough to break anything. More like somebody hitting the wall with both hands. The dogs exploded barking and rushed toward the hallway windows. I grabbed the shotgun the owners left beside the fridge and stayed awake until sunrise, sitting at the kitchen table. Nobody came inside. At first light, I walked around the outside of the house. The side wall near my bedroom had fresh mud smeared against it about shoulder height. Under the window were muddy boot prints. One set. The person had stood there long enough to leave deep impressions in the wet dirt. The prints led away from the house toward the orchard and disappeared once they reached the dry ground between rows. I packed my bag before the sheriff arrived. He drove out after I called and showed almost no surprise when I explained what happened. We walked out to the tree together, but the dead dog was gone. Only the wire remained hanging from the branch. The sheriff found drag marks leading deeper into the orchard. He told me there had been problems around those farms for years. Livestock disappearing, dogs trapped or mutilated, seasonal workers reporting somebody watching them from tree lines at night. A few people claimed they found camps hidden near irrigation ditches and drainage areas around the orchards. The sheriff believed it was one man living off the land somewhere between properties. Drifter maybe, hunter maybe, nobody knew for sure. He trapped animals for food and stayed hidden by moving through farmland at night. Whenever workers or owners got too close to where he stayed, strange things started happening. He also said the missing flyers in the farmhouse weren't decoration. Most of those animals vanished from properties within a few miles of that orchard over the years. The sheriff searched the area later that week with dogs and drones, but never found the man. One deputy located an old campsite near a creek behind the orchard with animal bones, canned food, and piles of peach pits scattered around a fire ring. Whoever lived there had already moved on before they arrived. I left that same morning and never went back. A month later, my cousin told me the owners had hired another temporary worker during harvest season. The guy quit after 2 nights because he kept hearing whistling in the orchard after dark. My girlfriend and I found the strawberry farm by accident during a road trip through Central California. We had been driving most of the day and were trying to avoid paying for another motel. Gas alone was draining us. We passed a hand-painted sign near the highway advertising fresh strawberries, roadside camping, and cheap overnight spots for travelers. The farm sat about a mile down a cracked frontage road surrounded by flat fields and irrigation canals. Rows of strawberries stretched farther than I could see, covered with black plastic and low green leaves. The place looked active but quiet. Old tractors sat near metal sheds. A few faded trailers were parked beside a line of eucalyptus trees near the back of the property. The owner met us near a fruit stand built from plywood and corrugated metal. Older Hispanic guy in dusty jeans and work boots. Friendly enough. He looked tired more than anything. He charged us $20 cash to camp beside one of the irrigation canals behind the fields. He mentioned migrant workers stayed on the property during harvest months and pointed toward the trailers in the distance. By then, the sun was already dropping low. The fields turned orange in the evening light, and the air smelled like wet dirt and fertilizer mixed with sweet fruit. We parked beside the canal where he told us to stay and set up our tent on a dry patch of ground between gravel and weeds. The campsite itself felt isolated. You could still see the farmhouse and sheds if you stood up. But once you sat down near the tent, the rows of strawberries blocked most of the property from view. The plants were low to the ground, but there were thousands of them packed tightly together in perfect lines. Irrigation hoses ran through each row and reflected moonlight once it got dark. We spent the evening drinking cheap beer beside the tent and listening to insects and distant highway noise. A warm wind moved through the fields after sunset. Every now and then we heard workers laughing somewhere near the trailers, but nothing seemed strange. It honestly felt peaceful at first. Around midnight, we climbed into the tent and passed out almost immediately. I woke suddenly at 5:18 in the morning. At first, I thought the sound came from a dream. I stayed still inside my sleeping bag, listening to soft voices outside the tent. Whispering, not close enough to understand words. Just low, breathy sounds moving back and forth between multiple people. The sky outside the tent was still dark blue before sunrise. My girlfriend was asleep beside me. I checked my phone screen for the time while listening harder. At least 3 people. Maybe more. I figured workers were already heading out to the fields early before the heat started. Then I realized the voices weren't moving. They stayed in one place. I slowly turned toward the mesh side of the tent and looked out. Figures stood between the strawberry rows maybe 30 yards away, completely still. I remember seeing shapes first before details. Thin silhouettes against the darker field. One looked taller than the others. Another stood with arms folded tight across the chest, all facing our tent. I felt cold immediately. I nudged my girlfriend awake as quietly as possible and kept staring outside. None of the figures moved while she woke up. The whispering continued in short bursts. It sounded nervous more than aggressive. No footsteps, no rustling plants, just whispering. Then one of them gave a soft whistle. Not loud, short and controlled. The reaction happened instantly. Every figure dropped straight down into the strawberry rows and disappeared completely from sight. That scared me worse than if they had rushed toward us. The movement was too fast and practiced, like they already knew exactly how to hide inside the crops. My girlfriend grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. We stayed frozen for maybe 20 seconds listening. Nothing. Not even movement through the plants. I grabbed the flashlight from beside our bags and shouted that I was calling the cops. My voice cracked halfway through because I realized I couldn't tell how many people were actually out there. No answer came back. I flashed the light across the rows, but the plants were too low and dense. The beam only showed leaves, plastic sheeting, and drifting mist over the irrigation canals. For the next 20 minutes, we stayed inside the tent, barely speaking. The sky slowly brightened enough to reveal the field in pieces. Birds started making noise near the canal. Somewhere far off, an engine started up. Once daylight spread across the farm, we finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Nobody was there. The rows looked empty all the way to the far end of the property. Then I noticed the crushed plants. Several patches near our campsite had been flattened completely. Leaves pressed into the dirt. Irrigation hoses pushed sideways. One spot looked almost shaped like a body had been laying there for a long time. There were at least 4 separate areas where somebody had hidden close enough to watch us while we slept. Fresh mud marks showed where knees and elbows had pressed into the ground. One cigarette butt sat near the canal embankment, still damp from morning dew. We packed everything fast after that and drove toward the farmhouse. The owner stood outside loading crates into the back of an old truck. The second I mentioned people hiding near our tent, his expression changed. Not shocked, just tired. He got quiet for a long moment, staring toward the fields before finally admitting they sometimes had problems with people sneaking onto the property. Some were undocumented migrants trying to avoid immigration checkpoints near the highways. Others were homeless drifters stealing food or looking for places to sleep without getting reported. He explained that workers occasionally found makeshift camps hidden along irrigation canals and drainage ditches around the farms in that county. People moved between properties at night because the fields provided cover from roads and police patrols. The thing that stayed with me was how normal he acted about it. Like finding strangers hiding feet away from sleeping campers was just another problem farmers dealt with. We left immediately after that. Neither of us said much while driving. My girlfriend kept checking the mirrors every few minutes like she expected somebody to follow us out from the fields. About a week later, I came across a local news article online about a woman who disappeared near agricultural camps in the same county. She had been traveling through the area alone and was last seen near farmland outside a small town less than 20 miles from where we stayed. Police believed transient workers or squatters may have seen something, but nobody cooperated with investigators. The article mentioned hidden camps near irrigation systems and abandoned field housing. That was enough for me. I stopped romanticizing roadside camping after that trip. What bothers me most now isn't the thought of criminals or drifters. It's waking up and realizing strangers had been lying silently in those strawberry rows watching us for hours while we slept completely unaware. Rows of empty hog pens stretched down both sides. Rusted gates. Concrete floors slick with moisture. Pipes hanging overhead. Water dripped steadily somewhere deep inside the building. The yellow light came from a single bulb near the far end. I knew there shouldn't have been power. That bothered me immediately. Extension cords snaked along the wall toward the back, disappearing through a doorway near an old office section. Somebody had rigged electricity somehow. Then I noticed the footprints. Bare human footprints in the mud. Not boot prints. Actual bare feet. They crossed the aisle and disappeared through several open stall gates on the right side. Every gate on that side stood open. Every single one. The left side remained closed. I remember hearing my own breathing inside the flashlight beam. The building felt occupied. Not haunted. Occupied. Like somebody nearby was holding still and listening. I moved farther inside, maybe 20 feet. The flashlight beam passed across old feed bins and broken dividers. Then something shifted near the far end behind a metal panel. Big movement. Heavy. I stopped immediately. A breathing sound came from behind the divider. Deep breaths through the nose. Human breaths, but labored. Somebody large or exhausted. I called out once. No answer. The breathing stopped too. The silence afterward felt wrong enough that my stomach tightened. I started backing toward the entrance. That was when I heard my name. Right beside me. Not shouted. Whispered calmly near my ear. Tyler. I spun around so hard my flashlight slipped from my hand and hit the concrete. The beam rolled sideways across the floor. Nobody stood there. I could hear movement now farther down the aisle. Slow footsteps through shallow water. Then the voice again. Tyler. This time farther away. The voice sounded amused, like whoever it was enjoyed watching me panic. I grabbed the flashlight and ran. The second I turned toward the exit, metal gates started slamming behind me. One after another. Bang, bang, bang. Fast. The sound exploded through the barn in sequence, moving closer each second. It sounded exactly like somebody sprinting behind me while kicking gates shut along the aisle. I never looked back. I hit the side door at full speed, stumbled into the mud, got up again, and ran straight for my truck. My keys slipped once because my hands shook so hard. I locked the doors immediately after climbing inside. The barn light stayed on. I remember seeing movement through the doorway while backing out. A figure standing near the aisle entrance. Tall, mud on the legs, no shirt, just standing there watching. I drove out so fast I nearly tore through part of the fence near the gate. I barely slept that night. The next morning Randy called asking where I went. I told him exactly what happened, every part of it. For a while he said nothing. Then he admitted the old owner used to bring in migrant workers during harvest seasons and keep them housed on the property. According to Randy, some workers tried leaving after pay disputes years earlier. One man disappeared after getting into a fight with the owner inside the far barn. Sheriff reports never proved anything because most of the workers left town afterward. but people around Boonville still talked. Not openly, just enough that nobody wanted the property. Randy finally admitted something else too. He and Cole had found signs somebody was living in the far barn earlier that week. Food wrappers, empty water jugs, blankets hidden behind feed bins. Randy assumed it was transients and decided not to involve police unless equipment went missing. After hearing my story, he drove back out there with deputies that same afternoon. They found a generator running behind the barn hidden under a tarp. That explained the light. Inside the office area, they found old stained mattresses, canned food, knives, and several chains bolted into concrete walls near the rear stalls. Some looked old enough to date back years. Others looked newer. The man living there was gone by then. But deputies found fresh animal blood in buckets near a drain trench and fresh footprints matching what I saw. Bare feet. Large adult male. A few days later, another nearby farmer reported somebody trying to break into a machine shed before dawn. Deputies searched woods around the county for over a week but never caught anyone. I quit the job immediately. A month later, Randy sold the salvage rights to another crew from Colombia. None of them stayed after dark. The county finally demolished the barns sometime in 2020. I still think about that whisper sometimes. Not because I believe anything supernatural happened. I don't. I think somebody had been living in that barn a long time. Long enough to learn our names while watching us work all week from somewhere nearby. Long enough to know when people stayed late and when they left. The part that still gets to me is how close he had to be when he whispered my name the first time. Close enough that I should have seen him. Close enough that if I had stayed inside another few seconds, he probably would have reached me before I got out of that building. I was 21 that winter and broke enough to say yes to almost anything that paid cash. Cole and I had known each other since high school. We weren't close after graduation, but every few months one of us would message the other. In January of 2009, he called asking if I wanted a week of work at his family's cattle farm in Alberta. A blizzard had hit hard 2 days earlier. One hired hand got stranded in Red Deer and another guy quit after his truck slid into a ditch on the county road. Calving season had already started, and his dad needed bodies more than experience. 3 of us drove out together in a rusted Dodge with chains in the bed and extra diesel cans strapped down with frozen rope. The roads got worse the farther south we went. Snow drifts covered entire stretches of gravel road. Fence posts looked like black teeth sticking out of white fields. I remember thinking the land looked empty in a way I'd never seen before. No houses, no lights, just old barns, power poles, and miles of frozen pasture. Cole's family farm sat at the end of a narrow road buried between tree lines and open fields. The farmhouse was small and yellow with snow piled halfway up the porch railing. The barns stood farther out near the calving sheds and feed silos. The wind never stopped. Even during daylight, you could hear it pushing against sheet metal and rattling loose chains. The work started before sunrise every morning. We checked pregnant cows, hauled feed, broke ice in water troughs, cleaned stalls, and dragged hay bales through knee-deep snow with an old tractor that barely started. The cold got inside your clothes fast. Every breath burned your nose. Your gloves froze stiff after an hour outside. The cattle were restless from the start. Not aggressive, nervous. The first night I noticed it was around 4 in the morning. I couldn't sleep because the furnace in the bunk room kept cutting on and off. I looked out the window toward the south pasture and saw almost the entire herd packed together near the fence line. Around 60 head standing shoulder to shoulder. None of them grazing, none laying down. They were all facing south toward the dark field beyond the fence. At first I thought maybe coyotes were out there, but the cattle didn't move around like they usually did when predators came close. They stood still. Every head pointed the same direction. The next morning I mentioned it while we worked in the shed. Cole barely reacted. He just said the cows had been doing that lately. His dad heard us and stopped shoveling feed for a second. He had this look people get when they're deciding whether something is worth talking about. Then he went back to work without saying anything. The second night it happened again. Same time, same fence. The herd crowded together tight enough that steam rolled off them in thick white clouds. A few calves cried out every few minutes, but the older cows stayed silent. Their ears pointed forward toward the field south of the property. I walked halfway out there with a flashlight before the wind drove me back. The beam barely reached beyond the fence posts. Snow blew sideways across the pasture hard enough to hide everything after 30 yards. When I got back inside, Cole's dad locked the mudroom door behind me. The third day, we found tracks around one of the feed piles near the south fence. At first glance, they looked canine. Large maybe, but still animal tracks. Coyotes were common out there. Wolves too sometimes. But farther from the fence, the prints changed shape where the snow got softer. The back impressions stretched longer. The heels sank deeper. By the time they reached the drift near the old tractor path, they looked almost human. Not exactly human. The feet were too long. I remember kneeling there trying to make sense of them while my hands froze inside wet gloves. Something about the stride bothered me too. The distance between steps was wrong. Too wide for a person walking through deep snow. Cole laughed it off in front of us, but he kept looking back toward the trees. That evening his dad checked every lock around the equipment shed before dark. The calving shed sat about 100 yards from the house. Around midnight we helped deliver a calf from a heifer struggling in the rear stall. Everything smelled like blood, wet straw, manure, and diesel exhaust from the heater running near the wall. By 3 in the morning everyone looked exhausted. I fell asleep sitting upright in a chair near the tack room. The screaming woke me. At first I thought it was one of the calves. Then I realized it was coming from outside. It sounded close enough to touch. Not loud either. Thin, high-pitched, wrong. I ran into the main section of the shed and saw the rear gate hanging open. Snow had blown halfway inside. One of the calves was gone. Blood covered the straw where it had been laying. Fresh drag marks led straight out through the doorway into the snow. Not enough blood for a clean kill. More like the calf had been pulled away alive. We grabbed flashlights and followed the trail. The wind had eased for once, and the moonlight reflected off the snow bright enough to see without lamps. The drag marks crossed the yard toward the south pasture. Halfway there we found places where something heavy had stumbled or shifted in the snow beside the calf. The tracks started normal again near the shed. Animal prints. Then farther out they stretched into those same long impressions. Human looking. Too big. One print near the fence was almost the length of my forearm. The steel bars on the south fence had bent outward from the middle. Not snapped. Bent wide enough for something large to force through. Cole stopped joking after that. His dad said we'd stay awake that night and watch the field. The 4 of us sat inside the equipment shed drinking burnt coffee from chipped mugs while frost built along the corners of the windows. The only light outside came from a flood lamp mounted above the south fence gate. Every few minutes one of us wiped condensation from the glass to look out. Nothing moved for hours. Around 4 a.m. the cattle started bunching together again. You could see them gathering from across the pasture. Dark shapes pressing tighter and tighter near the fence line. Then the floodlight shut off. Not flickering, just dead. A second later the screaming started again. It sounded almost like a calf at first, but there was a roughness in it that made my skin crawl. The pitch shifted too much, like someone trying to copy an animal without getting it right. Cole grabbed his rifle from beside the door and ran outside before anyone could stop him. The rest of us followed with flashlights. The cold hit like a wall. Snow squeaked under our boots as we crossed the yard. The cattle were packed together so tight some of them were pushing against the fence. Their eyes reflected pale white in the dark. Then I saw movement low beside them. Something crawling through the drifts. Not on all fours exactly. More like a person dropping forward onto their hands every few steps. The arms looked long because of the way it moved. The shoulders rose too high off the ground. Cole fired once toward it. The sound echoed across the field and everything stopped moving instantly. No scream, no running, nothing. For a second, the entire pasture went silent except for the wind. Then whatever had been there disappeared into the dark beyond the fence. We didn't chase it. None of us wanted to. At daylight, we followed blood trails leading south toward the creek beyond the trees. The blood was bright against untouched snow. About 200 yards from the pasture, we found half the missing calf buried beneath a drift beside the frozen creek bank. The hide had been stripped unevenly, meat torn away in chunks. What stayed with me was the smell. Not rot. Fresh blood mixed with wet fur and something sour underneath. Near the carcass we found more tracks. This time they made sense. A huge injured wolf had been stepping into and over its own front prints while dragging part of the calf sideways. The melting and refreezing snow had distorted the tracks into those long shapes we kept seeing. One rear paw was damaged badly, probably from an old trap or gunshot injury, which explained the strange gait and deep heel-like impressions. The bent fence made sense too after we looked closer. Snow and ice had weakened the welds near the posts. A large animal slamming into it repeatedly could have warped the bars outward. Even the screaming had an explanation eventually. That afternoon we found bloody marks and fur caught along an abandoned irrigation pipe south of the property. The pipe narrowed near one end. Cole's dad believed the wolf had been forcing air through the pipe while feeding or calling, creating those distorted sounds we heard across the pasture. Coyotes and wolves already made noises that sounded unsettling in open fields. Echoes carried strangely over snow. What we saw moving low beside the cattle was most likely the injured wolf dragging itself awkwardly through deep drifts after being hit by the rifle shot. Later that day, we found blood drops leading into the woods where the trail vanished among frozen brush and hard ground. No one said much after that. The fear had already settled into the place long before we understood what we were looking at. Cole's dad sold the farm that spring because the winter losses nearly ruined him. Between missing calves, storm damage, veterinary costs, and isolation, he couldn't keep the operation going. The wolf attacks were only part of it, but they pushed him over the edge. He never admitted being scared, though I think he was. Living miles from anyone changes how fear works. Every sound carries farther. Every problem feels larger. Out there, one injured predator in the dark could start feeling like something else entirely. I still remember standing near that south fence on the last morning before we left. The snow had hardened overnight and the entire field looked blue under the early light. Nothing moved anywhere. No tracks, no birds, just endless white stretching toward the trees. I understood then why the cattle kept staring into the dark every night. They noticed it long before we did. The old man grabbed my arm, so suddenly I almost swung at him from reflex. His fingers dug hard into my jacket, stronger than I expected. His face looked different up close, pale and sweaty despite the cold weather. He pulled me backward away from the door. I jerked loose immediately. Every alarm in my body was going off by then. I told him the delivery was done and headed back to the truck without finishing the paperwork correctly. I didn't care anymore. He followed a few steps behind me but stopped halfway there. I climbed in fast and locked the doors before starting the engine. The owner just stood in the rain watching. Not waving, not angry, watching. I started back down the driveway too quickly and nearly slid into one of the ditches. My hands were tight on the steering wheel. I kept checking the mirrors because I suddenly had this feeling someone was behind the truck even though I knew nobody was. About halfway out, I looked in the rearview mirror toward the chicken house one last time. There was a figure standing in one of the side windows. Not the farmer. Younger person. Male maybe. Hard to tell through the dirty glass and rain. Thin face. Dirt smeared across the skin. Dark hair hanging down over the forehead. He wasn't waving or yelling, just staring directly at the truck. I remember seeing one hand against the glass. Then the building disappeared behind trees as the road curved away. I drove straight to a gas station 20 miles out before stopping. My hands were shaking badly enough I spilled coffee trying to pour it. Part of me wanted to call the sheriff immediately. Another part kept telling me maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it was an illegal worker hiding from authorities. Maybe the farmer locked people inside to stop theft. Rural farms sometimes used rough methods that sounded insane to outsiders. Still, none of it sat right. The next morning, I told my supervisor everything. He got quiet during the description of the property. Then he asked for the address again. Turns out the regular driver who quit had refused to go back there after his last delivery. Nobody told me that beforehand. Around noon, a county deputy showed up at our supply warehouse asking questions. The deputy already knew the property owner. Years earlier, the man had been arrested after several undocumented workers escaped from the farm and reported being held there against their will. According to the deputy, the workers had been brought in for cash labor and housed inside converted livestock buildings. They claimed the owner beat them if they tried leaving before debts were paid off. The charges eventually fell apart because witnesses disappeared before trial. Some got deported. Others vanished completely. The farmer stayed on the property the entire time. The deputy told me they'd received occasional complaints over the years, but never enough evidence for another warrant. After hearing my report, they went out there that same evening. They found 3 men inside the chicken house, all undocumented workers. 2 were severely malnourished. 1 had an infected leg injury that looked untreated for weeks. The building had makeshift sleeping areas sectioned off with wire fencing and feed tarps. The exterior locks were real, so were the restraints attached to support beams inside. The farmer was arrested that night. The deputy later told me the men had been too terrified to speak much at first. They thought law enforcement would send them back across the border or return them to the owner somehow. One eventually explained they were forced to work salvage and scrap operations across abandoned farm equipment on the property. That explained the fields full of rusting machinery. The owner bought broken tractors and parts cheap, then stripped and resold them using labor he barely fed. The pounding I heard came from one of the workers trying to get attention after hearing my truck arrive. The face in the window belonged to a 22-year-old man from Guatemala. He weighed less than 100 pounds when deputies found him. For a long time after that, I kept replaying the moment beside the chicken house. The smell, the scratches near the lock, the way the old man looked at me when I got too close to the door. What bothers me most is how easily I could have ignored it. If I had finished the paperwork normally and driven away without looking toward that building, those men might have stayed trapped there through winter. I still drive past farms sometimes and think about how isolated those places can become once the sun goes down. Miles from town. No neighbors close enough to hear anything. No traffic. No witnesses. People disappear in places like that. Not because of monsters, because nobody thinks to look behind locked doors in the middle of nowhere. I spent almost 6 years delivering livestock medication across rural parts of eastern Kansas. Cattle vaccines, antibiotics, dewormer, syringes, mineral tubs, whatever farmers needed. Most days were simple. Long roads, muddy boots, coffee from gas stations, paperwork on clipboards. You got used to strange properties and strange people after a while. Farmers could be quiet. Some looked exhausted all the time. Some drank too much. Some stared at you too long because they hadn't spoken to another person in days. Still, there were places that felt wrong the second you pulled onto the land. This was one of them. It happened in November of 2021 during a cold, wet stretch where the sky stayed gray for nearly 2 weeks straight. The regular driver for the southern route had quit suddenly. Nobody said why. The office manager acted irritated anytime his name came up. I figured he found another job. Near the end of the day, I got handed one last emergency delivery: poultry antibiotics and disinfectant concentrate. Rush order. The address looked unfamiliar even though I knew most farms in those counties by memory. The GPS kept losing the road. I remember stopping twice because the map kept spinning in circles. The farther out I drove, the worse the roads got. Pavement turned into cracked gravel, then mud with tire ruts deep enough to pull the truck sideways. The sun was already low when I found the driveway. It looked more like an overgrown access road than an entrance to a working farm. Dead trees lined both sides, tall and black from years of rot and storm damage. Their branches leaned over the road like ribs. I had to slow almost to a crawl because the path narrowed so much my mirrors nearly scraped bark. The drive-in took forever. The property stretched farther than it should have. Empty fields sat on both sides covered in weeds and broken machinery. Old tractors were scattered everywhere. Some had sunk into the dirt up to the axles. Others sat tilted sideways with vines climbing over the wheels. None looked touched in years. Rain had started lightly by then, just enough to smear the windshield. I remember thinking the place looked abandoned until I finally saw lights ahead. The farmhouse was small and dark with peeling paint and a sagging porch roof. Behind it sat the chicken house. That building stood out immediately. It was enormous. Long metal structure, probably 300 feet at least. No exterior lights except one weak bulb near the side entrance. The whole thing looked sealed shut. The owner was already outside waiting when I parked. Thin older guy, late 60s maybe. Gray hair flattened against his head from moisture. Muddy overalls. His boots were caked so heavily it looked like he'd walked through wet concrete. He kept glancing behind him toward the chicken house while I unloaded the crates. Not casual glances either. Quick, nervous looks, like he was checking whether something was still there. The air smelled awful near that building. Not regular farm smell. I'd spent enough time around poultry houses to know the difference. Chicken farms smelled like ammonia, feed, wet feathers, manure. This smelled rotten, sweet and sour underneath the mud and rain. The owner barely looked at me while signing paperwork. His hands shook slightly. He asked if I wanted dinner because it was getting dark. I turned him down. He stood there another few seconds staring at me before asking again. That was the first moment my instincts started pushing at me. Not fear exactly, pressure. The kind that tells you not to get comfortable. I kept unloading while he carried crates toward a side storage area near the chicken house. He moved fast for an older man. Too fast, like he wanted things done before full dark. I was leaning against the truck hood finishing the delivery forms when I heard the first bang. Came from inside the chicken house. Not a metallic settling sound. Not machinery. A hard impact that shook the siding. I looked up immediately. The owner froze. Another bang hit a few seconds later. Then a third. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The metal walls vibrated. I asked if workers were inside because honestly that was the only thing that made sense. Migrant labor crews stayed on farms all the time during busy seasons. The old man paused too long before shaking his head. That pause bothered me more than the noise. I started walking toward the building before he could say anything else. The closer I got, the worse the smell became. Thick rot mixed with body odor and animal waste. The bulb above the side entrance flickered weakly in the rain. That was when I noticed the padlock. Big rusted thing latched from the outside. There were marks all around the handle. Deep scratches through layers of paint. Fresh ones too. Bright metal underneath. I remember staring at them while my stomach tightened. Then another impact hit from inside. Closer this time. Not random movement. It sounded human. My girlfriend Erin and I rented the farmhouse in January of 2021 because we wanted a cheap place to disappear for a few days after Christmas. We had both been working nonstop for months. I worked maintenance for an apartment complex outside Kansas City, and she worked at a dental office that stayed packed through the holidays. We wanted somewhere quiet with snow and no traffic. The listing looked perfect. The photos showed an old white farmhouse sitting alone beside open fields covered in snow. There was a stone fireplace, a wood stove in the kitchen, and a long gravel driveway lined with bare trees. The description called it a historic dairy property that had been in the same family for generations. Most of the reviews talked about how peaceful it felt. One thing in the listing stood out though. The barns behind the house were off limits. The owner mentioned old roofs and unstable flooring. The wording sounded serious enough that I figured the buildings were falling apart. I didn't think much beyond that. We arrived late in the afternoon while light snow was still falling. The property sat nearly 20 minutes from the nearest gas station, down a county road that narrowed into packed snow and ice. No nearby houses, no streetlights, just fields, fencing, and woods in the distance. The farmhouse looked exactly like the photos except older in person. Paint peeling around the porch rails, ice hanging from gutters, windows fogged around the edges from age. The place still looked clean though. Somebody maintained it enough to keep renters coming through. Behind the house sat the dairy barns. 3 long buildings connected by covered walkways and feed alleys. Old milk tanks stood beside one wall half buried in snow. Most of the metal siding was faded red and dark brown with rust creeping along the edges. One barn had broken upper windows covered with plywood sheets. Another leaned slightly to one side. The whole property felt frozen in time. The owner had left a lockbox key and instructions inside the kitchen. Heat worked fine. Water took a minute to warm up. Wood was stacked near the fireplace. Nothing unusual. That first evening actually felt relaxing. We cooked pasta, drank cheap wine, and watched snow blow across the fields through the living room windows. The silence outside was the kind you only get in the country during winter. No traffic, no people, just wind and the occasional creak from the old house settling. Around midnight, we went upstairs to bed. I woke sometime later to a mechanical noise outside. At first I thought I was dreaming because the sound came in short bursts. Metal clanking, then a hydraulic whine, then silence. A few seconds later it happened again. I checked my phone. 12:43 a.m. Aaron stayed asleep while I got up and looked through the upstairs bedroom window facing the barns. There were lights moving inside the far dairy building. Not bright floodlights, more like portable work lights or flashlights moving low through the structure. The sounds continued every few minutes. I figured the owner must have hired workers to repair equipment or move machinery. Dairy farms used all kinds of old hydraulic systems and lifts. It didn't seem worth worrying about. I went back to sleep. The next day we drove into town for coffee and groceries. The closest town barely looked active. Half the storefronts were empty. The cashier at the gas station recognized the farmhouse address immediately when I mentioned where we were staying. Not in a strange way, more like surprise that somebody rented it during winter. The roads iced over worse that afternoon, so we stayed inside the rest of the day. Snow kept falling lightly through evening. By dark, the driveway already had a fresh layer over our tire tracks. That night felt colder inside the house despite the heat running constantly. Wind pushed against the walls hard enough to make the upstairs windows rattle. Around 2:27 a.m. Aaron woke me. Not by shaking me, just sitting upright beside me. I could see moonlight reflecting off snow through the bedroom window. She was staring outside without moving. I asked what was wrong. She kept looking toward the yard and asked why somebody was walking around the house. The way she said it woke me instantly. I pulled back the blanket and moved to the window. Fresh footprints circled the farmhouse completely. One set, boot prints, deep enough to show whoever made them had some weight behind each step. The tracks looped around the house several times through untouched snow. No vehicle tracks anywhere beyond ours. No snowmobile marks either, just footprints. I remember feeling confused before scared. The property sat far enough from town that nobody would randomly walk there in the middle of the night during freezing weather. Then we heard steps on the porch below us. Slow wooden creaks moving toward the front door. One step at a time. The sound stopped directly beneath the bedroom. A few seconds later, the front doorknob rattled once. Not aggressively, just a single test of the handle. Then silence. I turned off the bedside lamp immediately. Erin already had her phone out trying to call the owner. No answer. I checked downstairs from the hallway window instead of going near the door. The porch light illuminated part of the front steps and railing, but nobody stood there anymore. The footprints continued off the porch into darkness beside the house. Neither of us slept the rest of the night. I kept hearing noises outside after that. Soft crunches in snow, metal tapping from somewhere near the barns. Once I heard machinery again for maybe 10 seconds before it stopped abruptly. At sunrise, we finally went downstairs. The cold near the front entrance felt stronger than the rest of the house. I checked the locks first. Everything remained secured. Outside, the tracks looked worse in daylight. Whoever walked around the farmhouse had circled it repeatedly for hours. Some prints overlapped while others cut new paths through drifting snow. Near the back side of the house beneath our bedroom window, the snow was packed down into a wide flattened area where someone had stood for a long time. Not just passing through, standing there, looking up. I felt sick seeing that. Then Aaron noticed another trail leading away from the house toward the dairy barns. Fresh prints, same tread pattern. We should have packed and left immediately. Instead, curiosity got the better of us. We followed the tracks across the yard toward the far barn where I'd seen lights the first night. Snow crunched loudly under our boots. The barn doors stood partly open despite the cold. Inside smelled like wet hay, rust, oil, and old manure. The interior was bigger than it looked from outside. Rows of metal stalls stretched through darkness. Pipes and old dairy equipment hung overhead. Some machinery looked decades old. Milking pumps, feed systems, hydraulic lifts covered in dust and grime. Then I noticed newer things mixed into the decay. A fresh extension cord, plastic water jugs, a propane heater near the wall. The footprints continued deeper inside. Behind stacked feed bins and old equipment, we found a makeshift living area hidden from the main aisle. Blankets laid over pallets, canned food, empty liquor bottles, batteries, flashlights, a camping stove, cigarette packs. Someone had been living there for a while, not recently for one night, long enough to organize supplies and keep warm through winter. The sleeping area itself looked filthy. Muddy blankets, grease stains, empty food cans scattered beside the wall. What bothered me most was how close it was to the house. Maybe 200 feet away. The person staying there could watch the farmhouse constantly. On the wall above the blankets hung newspaper clippings taped beside an old calendar. Most were local articles about the dairy closing in the late 90s after financial problems and labor disputes. One clipping stood out. A worker had disappeared during a snowstorm in 1997. The article mentioned he'd last been seen near the dairy barns during overnight maintenance work. Search teams found nothing except abandoned boot prints leading behind the property. The man was never located. I remember staring at the article while realizing whoever lived there had probably collected those clippings personally. Then Aaron grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. Fresh cigarette smoke drifted through the barn. Not strong, just enough to notice. I turned around immediately. Nobody stood in the aisle, but one of the hanging chain doors near the rear section was still moving slightly. We left right then. No hesitation. We walked fast back to the house without looking behind us, threw our bags into the car, and got out of there within 15 minutes. As we pulled down the driveway, I checked the mirror once and saw movement near the barn entrance. A man standing partly behind the doorframe watching us leave. Older guy, heavy coat, beard. He didn't chase us. He just stood there. The owner finally called back almost 2 hours later after we were already halfway home. I explained what we found and what happened during the night. He went quiet for a long time. Then he admitted somebody had been breaking into the dairy property off and on for years. Former workers, drifters, transients. He claimed local deputies checked the barns occasionally but never found anyone staying there permanently. What convinced me he knew more was how quickly he refunded the entire trip. No argument, no surprise, just immediate refund confirmation sent to my email within minutes. A few weeks later, I searched the property online and found an older local forum discussing the farm closure. Several people mentioned a former dairy employee who never fully left after the shutdown. According to old comments, he had serious drinking problems and blamed the owners for ruining his life after layoffs started. One person claimed he still returned during winters and stayed in the abandoned barns because he knew the property better than anyone. That explanation fit everything. The machinery sounds, the lights, the footprints, the packed snow beneath our window. He wasn't haunting the place. He was living there beside us the entire time, walking around the house while we slept, watching strangers stay in what used to be part of his life. My uncle's farm sat nearly 40 minutes from the nearest town in western Kansas. The roads out there were flat gravel strips cutting through dry pasture and open fields. At night, there were no lights except the farmhouse windows and the red blink from a radio tower miles away. I used to spend summers there as a kid while my parents worked. Back then, the place felt huge to me. Endless fencing, rusted cattle guards, water tanks covered in insects during July, long barns that smelled like hay, diesel, and manure baked into old wood. I stopped visiting much after high school. Life moved on. I worked construction for a while, then warehouse jobs. I was 28 when my uncle called saying he'd had surgery on his shoulder and needed help for a few weeks. He sounded older than I remembered, slower. I drove out there in late October. The farm looked smaller than it had when I was young, but rougher too. Paint peeled off the barn walls. One of the grain silos leaned slightly east. The cattle pens were muddy from recent rain, and the lower pasture near the creek had standing water in spots. The first night there my uncle explained the problem. Cattle kept getting out after dark. Not every night, but enough to matter. A few cows had wandered onto the county road earlier that month and almost caused an accident. At first he blamed bad latches or loose chains. Then he started noticing something strange. The gates weren't broken. They were opened cleanly, chains unhooked, latches lifted. Every time. The property covered several hundred acres, so checking everything took hours. We drove an old side-by-side along fence lines after dark using spotlights to look for gaps or loose animals. Wind pushed through the grass constantly out there. Fence posts creaked. Metal gates rattled. Coyotes barked in the distance almost every night. The first few nights felt normal enough. Exhausting, but normal. Then I started noticing small things. A feed bag left near the barn moved to the equipment shed overnight. A hammer disappeared from the workbench. One morning I found muddy boot prints near the water tank behind the calving barn. My uncle's boots had different soles. Mine too. There were cigarette butts near the fence by the north pasture. Wet from dew but fresh enough to still smell strong. Neither of us smoked. My uncle kept insisting local kids were messing around. There were a few farms within driving distance, and bored teenagers did dumb things sometimes. But something about it felt wrong to me. The property sat too far from town. You didn't accidentally wander out there. A week into my stay, we found one of the lower pasture gates wide open around 3 in the morning. The cattle had crowded near the road, but thankfully hadn't crossed. The chain hung loose exactly like someone had taken their time opening it. No damage. No tire tracks nearby either. The ground was soft enough that we should have seen something. That started getting to me more than I wanted to admit. Every night after that, I paid attention to sounds around the house. Footsteps outside. The barn door moving in the wind. The dogs barking toward the fields for no reason. Sleep got difficult. One night, I woke around midnight because the cattle were making noise outside. Not normal movement. Loud panicked bawling. My uncle was already awake pulling on boots when I came downstairs. He grabbed the spotlight and keys without saying much. The drive down to the lower pasture took maybe 5 minutes. The road curved along a drainage ditch before opening toward the creek field. The beams from the headlights bounced across fences and patches of dead grass. The cattle were grouped tightly near the far side of the pasture. Some pushed against the fence hard enough to shake the wire. Others stood frozen, facing the same direction. My uncle swept the spotlight across them. At first I thought it was a fence post standing between the cows. Then the light settled. A man stood among them. No jacket, no shirt, just dark pants soaked with mud. His skin looked gray under the spotlight. Mud covered his chest and arms like he'd crawled through a ditch. He stood completely still with his hands hanging at his sides. The cattle closest to him kept backing away but wouldn't fully scatter. What bothered me most was how calm he looked. The spotlight hit him directly in the face and he barely blinked. My uncle shouted toward him from the vehicle. The man slowly turned his head toward us. I still remember the smile. Not huge, not exaggerated, just unfamiliar, like someone forcing themselves to copy an expression they hadn't used in years. His lips pulled back too slowly. His face barely moved except for the mouth. For a second I thought he might walk toward us. Instead he turned and started walking deeper into the field. Not fast, not stumbling, just steady slow steps through the dark grass toward the creek line. We followed in the vehicle for a short distance before the ground got too rough near the trees. By then he was gone into the darkness beyond the spotlight range. Neither of us slept after that. Police arrived the next morning with 2 deputies and a county tracker. They searched the woods south of the pasture first. Around noon, one deputy found an old storm bunker hidden behind overgrown brush near the creek embankment. I remembered it immediately once I saw it. My grandfather had built it decades earlier during tornado season. I completely forgot it existed. The entrance sat partially underground beneath rusted metal doors, hidden under weeds and collapsed branches. Inside smelled like mildew, mud, spoiled feed, and human waste. There were empty feed sacks stacked against the wall, old blankets, rusted cans, plastic water jugs filled from cattle troughs. They found tools missing from our barn, batteries, rope, and dozens of cigarette butts crushed into the dirt floor. The man had been living there for months. The deputies later explained he was mentally ill and had drifted between abandoned properties across several counties. He avoided roads and mostly moved through fields and drainage areas. He'd apparently learned how to work gate latches while wandering farms looking for food and shelter. Sometimes he opened gates intentionally to move cattle away from areas where he crossed the property at night. What shocked everyone was how often he'd been near us without being seen. The police found paths worn through grass behind the barns and along fence lines. They also discovered several gates around the property partially unlatched, ready to swing open with enough pressure from cattle. The reason the cows acted terrified near the lower pasture made sense afterward. He spent most nights wandering among them because the animals gave off heat during the cold weather. The tracker believed he sometimes slept inside empty feed trough shelters near the herd. Police took him away that afternoon without incident. One deputy later told my uncle the man was severely malnourished and covered in untreated cuts and infections from living outside so long. After they cleared the bunker out, the problem stopped immediately. No more open gates, no missing tools, no cigarette butts, nothing. I stayed another week helping repair fences and clean the property. We sealed the bunker entrance with welded steel plates afterward. Even during daylight, the place bothered me. Knowing somebody had been living that close for months without us realizing it changed how the entire farm felt. At night, I still caught myself scanning the pastures whenever cattle grouped together too quietly. What stayed with me wasn't the fear exactly. It was the image of that man standing motionless among the cows under the spotlight like he belonged there more than we did.